All right, well, this is Ralph Sievert with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board and the Urban Forestry Institute, and we are chatting today with State Senator Ellen Anderson. And the senator has the privilege of being the senator where emerald ash borer was first found in the St. Paul area, and I wish we could just ask her if she could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, that's correct. I represent District 66 in St. Paul and Falcon Heights, and those are the two communities where emerald ash borer was first discovered in the state of Minnesota, right in my neighborhood. And so I have a very personal interest in trying to do whatever we can as a state to save our ash trees and have an effective plan to respond to the emerald ash borer.
And if I understand it right, and don't be shy, and you've also been very instrumental in making sure that some of those legacy funds are directed towards emerald ash borer, which a lot of the cities are appreciating quite a bit.
That's right. And, you know, the voters will remember in 2008 we passed the constitutional amendment for clean water, land, and legacy. And one of those funds that is dedicated in the Constitution is for protecting habitat. And so last year what we did was take $2 million of those legacy dollars and direct them specifically to the emerald ash borer, to response, to preparation and planning and emergency response. And I strongly believe that protecting those urban trees and those urban forests are a critical part of maintaining healthy habitat in our state. And it will also protect the northern trees. If we just let this emerald ash borer go wild and don't do anything, then our northern forests are next. And they are at great risk because we have millions and millions of ash trees around the state of Minnesota. But I think over the long term we do need to do more to help cities respond, because I know in the city that I live in St. Paul and Falcon Heights, which I represent, they're spending so much money taking down diseased ash trees, planting new shade trees, and trying to find ways to discover where the infestations are. That's going to cost a lot of money. And so we could at least protect some trees, and we could make sure that we replace trees where we've lost them. So, you know, having urban trees, not only is it important to protect the urban trees so they don't infect the trees across the whole state in the wild areas, but it also provides so many benefits. You know, it helps to cool our cities, it helps to protect the air quality and reduce carbon emissions, and it protects the water quality, because those trees, they absorb so much water in their roots. So if you plant trees, you're not going to have as much polluted water running into our streams and waterways. So trees provide so much good, and they're also the home to all those birds and other critters that we love and that we want to maintain in our state.
Okay, great. Senator, we really appreciate your taking the time to join us here on Why Trees Matter, and also for being such a good friend of the urban forest.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
I thought I would start just by talking a little bit about the legislative session and give you the latest on my take on some issues that I'm most involved in at the legislative session, but then talk about how policymakers take on the whole issue of emerald ash borer and caring for our urban forests. I was a strong supporter of the 3/8 cent sales tax that the voters passed in 2008 in Minnesota. Our voters in 2008 on the ballot approved a small increase in the sales tax that will be dedicated by the Constitution for 25 years for the purposes of protecting clean water, land and habitat, parks and trails, and our cultural and historical resources. And the level of support for that by the voters in Minnesota was the highest vote count for any natural resources initiative in our nation's history, and it surpassed our vote for President Obama in 2008. So it was significant, and I really appreciate what that says about values of Minnesotans and what they hold dear, which is protecting our natural resources and making sure that those things that are so near and dear to our quality of life are protected for our future generations and our children and grandchildren. And I have the privilege of overseeing many of those funding streams in my budget. The clean water, the habitat, and the parks and trails budgets. I don't deal with the cultural and arts part of it in my jurisdiction, so I can't answer those questions as much. but I've been very adamant about making sure that we set up a structure to protect those funds which are constitutionally dedicated and separate from the regular state budgeting process, to protect them, to make sure we don't raid them to balance the budget, because that was the promise we made to the voters, and that's what the Constitution requires, and to make sure that we have accountability for how those dollars are spent. And I think it's more important than your average budget item, because the public weighed in and the public spoke on this. The public said this is important, and I want to keep the faith with the public on that. So we've worked very hard to set up funding programs that have clear outcomes for what results we want to achieve with the money, and then setting up an accountability structure so that we can evaluate those outcomes and make sure we're getting value for our money. We also passed the yearly appropriation for the 1/3 of the constitutional funds that goes to Habitat or through the Heritage Fund. That's an annual appropriation, and there's a group called the Lessard Sams Outdoor Heritage Council. That council put together recommendations which the legislature approved for $58 million in funding for protecting, restoring, and enhancing thousands of acres of prairies, forests, wetlands, and other habitat around the state of Minnesota. And one of the things that I was really focused on in our RFP was to make sure that we don't forget the metropolitan area, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. And last year, in May of 2009, I was sitting in the conference committee on the very first bill that was going to allocate the funds from those constitutional legacy dollars that I talked about. And I was sitting in that conference committee, and we were debating the issue of whether, what heritage funds should be used for, and the press came in and told us that they had discovered emerald ash borer bugs right in my district, right near the corner of University and Raymond. And so we have been very much involved in that discussion. And so what I want to talk about today is my take as a policymaker on these issues. I'm not an expert, as I said before. I'm a policymaker. I want to, do my job by trying to get the very best advice from the day-to-day practitioners, the scientists, the experts, the local governments that I work with closely who are handling these issues, bring in as much expertise as I can, and then try to decide how that should guide our policy responses. And so from that perspective, I want to talk a little bit about my views on where we're going with the emerald ash borer management, and start by talking about why it matters. Why do urban trees matter? Urban trees lower air conditioning costs, reduce winter heating bills for those of us indoors, and outdoors, of course, provide shade, improve our quality of life, improve our recreation options, cool off the whole city by reducing the urban heat island effect, because of the shade and the evaporation from the leaves. Those trees in urban areas help improve our air quality. They hold the soil in place and help prevent erosion. They absorb stormwater that might otherwise pollute water by running off. That a typical urban forest of 10,000 trees will retain 10 million gallons of rainwater per year. That's pretty significant. Trees help slow global climate change by absorbing carbon dioxide, obviously the largest greenhouse gas. They help reduce noise pollution. They provide wildlife habitat. And I'll probably talk a little bit more when we talk about the funding streams, about that whole issue about, do we have habitat here in the metropolitan area? Do we have habitat here in the cities? And I believe we do, and I believe we need to protect it. Trees obviously improve property values. We all know that. We all know in our own properties that maintaining those trees adds value to our home. One study shows that it increases property values by 10 to 20%, and it obviously attracts home buyers when you're trying to sell your home. Trees create beautiful and attractive parks. Imagine our parks without trees in them. As I was writing this, I was thinking about Newell Park in St. Paul and Minnehaha Falls Park in Minneapolis, right in the middle of urban communities, beautiful oak trees. I think both of those represent oak savanna areas where the trees have been maintained. And now you have mowed grass, but they still have that beautiful canopy of oaks. And people love them, and they attract millions of visitors to those beautiful parks that we have in our cities. And that means revenue to our cities, so it really translates into dollars. We need trees in our cities and in our towns to connect people with nature. And we also need to support that green infrastructure, those ecological systems, so that birds and flora and fauna and all the related parts of our ecosystem can thrive and survive even in the middle of cities. The U.S. Forest Service recently did a study of Minneapolis trees and found, that Minneapolis has almost 1 million trees in its city. That's a lot of trees. And the Forest Service study evaluated what those trees mean to that city in dollars and cents, and what they came up with is that annually those trees save Minneapolis $6.8 million in energy costs, $9.1 million in stormwater treatment cost savings, and $7.1 million in aesthetic and property values. So, we know trees are valuable. So we were very devastated when we found that the emerald ash borer had reached our communities. And just to summarize some of the statistics that I have learned, emerald ash borers killed more than 40 million ash trees nationally. I'm not even sure if that's enough, because if that number is correct, it seems kind of low to me. Because we know in Minnesota we have somewhere between 800 million and 900 some million ash trees around our state. Millions in our acres of northern forests, and hundreds of thousands of ash trees just in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area alone. Minneapolis, I said before, they have almost 1 million trees, and the numbers that I saw, approximately 20% of those are ash trees, so a couple 100,000. In St. Paul, even more. These numbers kind of astounded me, but I got these from the city documents, so hopefully they're right. St. Paul said about 25% of the public trees in our right-of-ways, open spaces, parks, are ash trees. That's about 450,000. Adam, is that right? 450,000 ash trees? Okay, well, we'll look it up later. I got the reports here. That is a heck of a lot of ash trees that we're worried about. And of course, when the emerald ash borer was discovered here in St. Paul, the experts that found it estimated that it was probably in the trees 3 to 4 years already, probably more widespread than has been uncovered. And likely it will be in St. Paul permanently. So what does that mean? What can we do about it? So what I wanted to do was just survey what some of the plans and ideas are and give you my gut reaction to those. And so I live in St. Paul. I'll start with St. Paul's report, their management plan, which I went through last night in some detail. And St. Paul's looking at a wide range of approaches, including removing trees, girdling, those purple traps you see everywhere, what they call destructive sampling, insecticide treatment, a whole range of ideas. In St. Paul, one of the unique things is that most of the removed trees will be chipped and sent to our district energy plant in downtown St. Paul in our biomass burner that provides energy to downtown businesses and the state capitol complex, renewable energy. Other approaches that we've used in Minnesota, obviously the Department of Ag very quickly issued a quarantine for 3 affected counties when the beetle was first discovered. And we in the legislature passed guidelines and legislation relating to transport of firewood, and that's part of the quarantines as well. I also looked at the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center, which is a group of entomologists and experts from universities at Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, in conjunction with the USDA and U.S. Forest Service. And they also talked about the issue of what insecticide options are useful. If you have relatively healthy ash trees and you're within a known infestation range of 10 to 15 miles, then it might be worth treating trees with an effective insecticide treatment. Now, I think that's helpful to have some guidelines, but I thought about Minneapolis-St. Paul and the number of ash trees that we have just in Minneapolis-St. Paul alone. And so if you took that radius around our cities, you'd be talking about hundreds of thousands of trees potentially that you could envision treating, and that would be a cost of millions and millions of dollars. So the question really is it going to be better to remove these trees and replant the urban forests, or is it going to be better to focus on treating and trying to save affected trees, or do we need a balance? I don't know the answer, I'm just raising the questions. But what are some reasonable goals that we could focus on in the face of kind of a gloomy prognosis that maybe there is no solution? And believe me, this question came up in our discussions of funding, and I'll get to that in a minute. So some reasonable goals, I think, are to prevent the spread and to slow the spread of this beetle, to distribute the costs of certain and massive tree death, but to distribute that cost over a manageable time period. That would have some value. To reduce the negative impacts on quality of life by slowing or managing tree loss, even though we know that in the end we may lose the trees. And finally, we need to continue efforts to replenish the urban forest, no matter what. And so you think about the trends in local government funding, budget cuts, doing more with less. We need to be able to focus on our urban forests and their protection, but it will be a challenge in a time of diminishing budgets. So the Forest Protection Reserve grants are the main source of funding that we put out there for responding to the EAB crisis. And this was the proposal that was in that conference committee I mentioned a year ago in May when we were putting together our first legacy budget. I'm very grateful that the House of Representatives came forward and said, we're going to put some funding into the emerald ash borer, into protection and response and planning. So we had a $2 million project in there going through the Department of Ag to put those grants out. Now, that sounds like a simple matter, but it was extremely controversial. And so let me just talk a little bit about kind of the politics around that. The Constitution that sets up these funding streams for the Heritage Fund says that the mission of those dollars, and it's about $58 million a year in today's sales tax revenues, it's a lot of money, the mission is to protect, enhance, and restore forests, prairies, wetlands, and habitat for fish, game, and wildlife. And we've had a huge amount of discussion and controversy and debate at the Capitol and outside the Capitol over the last year about what do those words mean. And there is a very intense pressure from the hunting and fishing groups to have a very narrow interpretation and to be very vigilant, and there's frankly a lack of trust and a fear that the legislature is going to take that money and use it for kind of mushy, touchy-feely stuff that has nothing to do with protecting habitat. And so that's the context that we debated this. Should those heritage funds be used for protecting urban forests from the emerald ash borer? Because that's where the infestation started. So we were looking at grants that targeted the urban areas in particular and the urban forests. The Lessard-Sams definition that they used for protecting originally said it was action to maintain the ability of habitat and related natural systems to sustain fish, game, or wildlife through acquisition of fee title, in other words, buying the land, or through conservation easements. So a really narrow definition that doesn't say anything about protecting trees from invasive pests. It doesn't say anything about invasive species generally. It doesn't say anything about where these, what's a forest, what's a, what does this really mean? And so we had a lot of debate about it, and a number of members of Lessard-Sams Council believed that spending these dollars on emerald ash borer protection was unconstitutional. And some people even talked about lawsuits. I really disagreed with that, and I think it squarely fits in our mission of protecting forests. The other issue is whether urban forests count as habitat areas or as areas that, when the Constitution says we're going to protect forests, does that mean boulevard trees? Does that mean trees in parks? And again, I think it does. I think trees are trees, and when you put a group of them together, then critters live there. And you know, that's kind of my layperson's view of science. That's habitat. I live right by Como Lake in the city of St. Paul by a beautiful park. Every morning I wake up to the sound, I keep my windows open, and I wake up to the sound of hundreds and hundreds of birds, and I love it. And I'm in the middle of a city. Now, St. Paul's not a typical city, but it looks kind of like a suburb compared to some places. But we've got birds, we've got wildlife, we've got critters, and the researchers will tell you that, you know, we live right by the biggest migratory flyway in North America along the Mississippi River. And we have a hot spot right in Como Park where there's been dozens of bird species found. So in my view, that's habitat, and when the voters voted to protect funding so we could make sure that that type of habitat exists now and into the future, they weren't just talking about forests that go on for millions of acres that you have to drive to if you live in the metropolitan area. They were talking about all around us. And I think that's a critically important issue, and we've, again, had a lot of debate about that. When I was originally on the Lessard-Sams Council, I literally heard some people say there's no habitat in the metropolitan area and that your constituents don't need it anyway because they all go up north to hunt and fish. I can't tell you how strongly I disagree with that, but I think that we're making progress. And one of the things that we did last year was to say that we had to put together a plan based on the ecological regions of the state. And so the council did that. They did a really good job of focusing on the needs of different parts of the state and the unique ecological characteristics and the metropolitan urbanizing area, which includes, you know, a lot of areas that aren't really very urban. If you talk about 11 counties, we're part of that. And so I think we're evolving, and I think that's moving in the right direction of understanding that habitat is everywhere in our state, and it needs to be protected everywhere, up north and in the city as well, as long as you have something of value to habitat. And finally, the issue of public versus private land. And these grants were by law set up for public land, and not for private owners of property. And so this is going to be a continuing issue with public funds. The other bill that we passed with funding this year was part of our capital bonding bill, and this put $3 million out there for shade tree, for planting of shade trees, replacing trees lost by pest, disease, or storm, and for establishing a more diverse forest. Those, by Constitution, bonding dollars have to only be used on publicly owned land. So they're called public trees, and they have to be on public land. And so we have those restrictions facing us in a number of funding streams, and that will be an issue into the future as we try to really deal with emerald ash borer and its impact. Because if you have it on someone's private property, it sure is going to affect the forest just as much as the tree across the street in the park. You know, we've passed restrictions on firewood labeling. This past legislative session, we also passed legislation relating to tree care and setting up more standards for professional registration of tree care companies so that consumers can be protected and there can be high standards available. So people know that when they put money into taking care of their trees, they're going to get someone who's qualified to do that. Real quickly, let me just say some of my conclusions after all this that I've focused on. Number one, we need to continue to do whatever we can to save our urban and our northern forests, but with certain cautions. We don't want to waste money, and we sure don't have money to waste in today's budget times. We don't want to waste it on unproven or ineffective or potentially harmful approaches. We want to do no harm to the environment or public health. We want to protect consumers and government, the public, from wasting money on saving trees that can't be saved. We want to be truthful and realistic about what's possible we need to keep funding research, and we need to adequately support our local governments and our state efforts to maintain and improve our urban and wild forests. And so that's a difficult balance to achieve, but I guess that's the challenge I'll throw out to you and tackle this problem. Thank you so much.
Why Trees Matter is brought to you by the Urban Forestry Institute. Our sponsors today were Rainbow Tree Care Companies, Science, Service, and Satisfaction, and the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board.